So, Brian,
Yeah,
you're at JP Morgan Chase,
I am.
and your bank may be a surprise to some, but is committed to carbon removal credits, $200 million as part of a broader, I think I even saw figures up to $1 trillion over a longer period of time towards decarbonization and sustainability efforts. Am I right? So can you put that in context for us?
Yeah, so two sort of separate things you mentioned.
Yeah.
I'll clarify a bit. So we have a $2.5 trillion commitment to underwrite and facilitate finance to support a lot of different things. $1 trillion of that specifically to green solutions.
Okay.
We also committed for our own use.
What is the difference between green solutions and the ungreen
Sustainable
solutions?
development, economic development in emerging markets, things like that. So
That's within the trillion.
right. The $1 trillion is specifically green tech.
Oh, it's about the
Right.
okay.
The other 1.5 is for the other stuff.
Got it.
The 200 million you mentioned is for our own use. JP Morgan committed $200 million so far to engineered carbon removal to address scope 1 emissions by 2030 and beyond. And so the goal is that all of our scope 1 emissions will be covered by engineered removal by that time frame. We think we'll beat it. But the idea was to sign long-term contracts to start building that portfolio. But to your point, the 200 isn't the end, that's the first. And so continue to build that portfolio and grow it and support more companies and more technologies.
Now,
against scope.
most people probably know this, but can you define your terms? What are engineered carbon removals as opposed to any other sort of removals? And I know that'll get into your wheelhouse, but since this guy's putting the money on the table, let's see what he's willing to, what he's actually paying for.
So engineered removal, and let me be clear, we still use nature-based solutions for all of our scope 3 operational emissions. So we're trying to support the market holistically, but very, very specifically ring fencing that scope 1 stuff with engineered. We define engineered as the stuff you would typically think of, I think maybe with one exception. So it's DAC, it's bikers, it's BECS, it's direct ocean capture. Biochar, we put into the nature-based category. We do support biochar. We just, when we purchase it, we use it against our scope 3.
Right.
And so the idea there is you sort of create this interesting dynamic between your reporting, your accountability across the scopes, and what you're willing to pay for those things, which creates a natural marginal cost of abatement to do more work and deploy more capital against your more sort of controllable emissions like scope 1.
And this is a commitment from your company unilaterally, as it were, on your own, because there are entities like the Frontier Coalition,
Which we're members of. Yep.
which you're a member of, right? So there's sort of buyers coalitions, advanced market commitments that are made. So there are different ways of going about this. Microsoft has been a leader in this space in some ways as well. But this $200 million is your own money. You're not counting any pals in this coalition.
So to be clear, it includes 75 million of us joining Frontier as well. So 75 million of our procurement
of your commitment to Frontier.
Correct. Yeah, we've joined Frontier at a $75 million bite. Yeah.
Right. And so, but sorry, where I'm going with this is that this is a significant amount especially when we consider the size of the market we're talking about. That is, the companies are often relatively small startups. We're at the very early stages of developing engineered solutions.
Correct.
And if we look at the potential, if we believe the science of the IPCC, and in this house, we still believe in science here at The Economist, whatever may happen in other places, the IPCC argues very strongly that against what was at the time green orthodoxy, that argued with direct air capture and other means of negative emissions, that in the second half of this century, we need to go not just to net zero, we need to go to negative emissions. And to do that, we do need to develop these technologies to scale so that they're available to deal with the overshoot problem that we're likely to have, increasingly likely to have, unfortunately. Right? So that sort of sets the groundwork. But at the moment, these are nascent technologies and industries with very promising futures. One of them is here. So let me turn to Dominic. Dominic, tell us about Carbon Future. What is it your firm does, and how do you fit in this picture?
Sure. So Carbon Future really focuses on carbon removal per se, and on all technologies that can remove carbon from the atmosphere or the biosphere and store it for multi-hundreds of years. So sometimes referred to as the technical solutions. And we started in the market saying like, okay, it's largely a voluntary act now. So for people to act, they need to at least trust that the climate service that they're buying is actually the climate service that is done. So we started really building a solution for suppliers to ingest the right data, transparently track the carbon from production to where it rests in peace, make sure it's verified so that you know the ton that is removed is a ton removed. And so we think that an infrastructure like that is important to kind of support a market that needs to grow quicker than TikTok on an annual basis. So that's how we kind of started. That's the role that we play mainly in the.
So what is the analogy from another industry that you can use? Is it the SAP or Oracle of carbon removal, or are you the PricewaterhouseCoopers? Give us something we can understand, because it is a nascent business. So what are we talking about here?
That would really be kind of like the OS or the operating system for the supplier, to make sure that the right data is inserted, because we're not a verifier per se. Before the credit goes to market, there's always a third party that comes in and actually verifies.
Right.
I think that's important, because otherwise we have a perverse incentive. Because on the other hand, we go out there and structure multi-year deals with net zero buyers to make sure that given multi-year, they can source the service that they need at lowest transaction costs, creating the predictability of price or income actually on the supplier side, and guarantee or a predictability on price on the side of a corporate buyer, such as Swiss Re, such as Microsoft, such as JP Morgan.
Yeah. And in the work that you do, and when you deal in the clients that you have, what are their principal concerns? Right now, we know with nature-based solutions there have been significant concerns. There's been, I think, in the last few weeks, Microsoft specifically pulled back from nature-based solutions in some of their investments, moving towards engineered solutions. But are there other issues that you deal with that you help to sort out, whether to do with data quality or the verification? Someone I met earlier today, who's still in the audience, I think, her company does insurance for some of these credits. So I'm sure she may have something to say during Q&A. But we're seeing an ecosystem of validators and ancillary products and sort of emerging, as it often happens with new industries. What are the pain points that you think need to be addressed?
I mean, the pain points is definitely can I trust it? And that is a lot about just creating the transparency about accounting. The benefit of the durable removals, they're per se pretty quantifiable. And compared maybe to other parts of the carbon markets, avoidance, you don't have a counterfactual to prove. So it makes it easier to kind of really make sure that you can account for it and you can make that transparent. So I think that does a good deal already. And the other way is then obviously hey, I'm sourcing something, I'm sourcing a removal service that I will need to kind of meet my net zero target, because yes, we can reduce a lot, but there's always the unavoidable emissions. So how do I do that? At what price point can I, is it right to source? Because it is a pretty nascent market, and I think the volatility of price that you see in the market is pretty transparent. So how can I be sure that I pay the right price? I don't overpay, especially in a market where you could say I'm a first mover, so I don't want to pay more than the next one. So that's also things that we can help do by having view on a lot of projects. We kind of know their cost curves.
Yeah.
And we kind of see what the fair market price is, and we're going to try to stabilize that.
This is an interesting question, right? About what is the price for a good for which there is not really transparency. There's no often comparability, right? These aren't different engineering approaches, different cost curves to come down, or technology curves, learning curves. Is it? He's talking about paying the right price. People are looking to you to be the rich uncle, right? To come in and overpay. I gave Microsoft an example before, but when they paid for direct air capture credits from Climeworks for their project in Iceland, they paid €1,000 a ton, which is exorbitant. But they felt it was right to help bring down the cost as a first mover. It was part of their policy to help develop this marketplace, be an early mover, fit with their green commitment, as it were, to ultimately go not just net zero as a company, but net negative in the lifetime of their companies, what they've promised. And so when you say what is the right price, how do you guys think about it? Are you going to be penny pinching and get the cheapest credits and beat these young companies down into submission, or
no? I think we've done exactly the opposite. I hope we've done exactly the opposite, right? We haven't been penny pinching. We, as you mentioned, in the 200 million, there was Climeworks, there was Charm, there was a startup called CO280 that was not just pre-revenue, they were pre-money at the time. They hadn't even raised yet, and so the idea was to support multiple early technologies at different parts of their life cycle at different price points. So if you look at our that particular purchase, and I don't want to just lean on that because it was a couple of years ago now, those deliveries are starting now, but it's 800,000 tons for $200 million. So it's an average price per ton of $250 a ton.
Right.
And so I think when people think Climeworks, they think $1,000, $800, whatever the price is today. But the reality is if you're thoughtful about it and you build a smart portfolio and you diversify and you overweight to the lower cost stuff for now,
Yeah.
you can still support the upper end of the market and try to help them bring the price down. And so we were very conscious, not just in the development of that portfolio, but in the contracting stage, to not do what you were talking about. And don't beat those companies down. Recognize they need to raise capital. Recognize they need bankable contracts. And so for some of our offtake, we've actually brought our bankers in to say, can you make sure there are bankable terms in this contract? Mm-hmm. Would you actually underwrite if this company needed project finance in 5 years based on this offtake? And so that's been helpful for us in sort of being smart about it. And it's hard. It's hard for a big corporation and legal teams at big corporations to get comfortable with, who owns liability and what you're willing to take on. And it's been a learning curve for a lot of us in doing that. But I think we've been very conscious to not be the big sort of, the big bank about this and to really try to be supportive of the market.
And in addition to either altruism or sort of a forward-leaning approach to helping develop new technologies, I have heard the argument made that there's a certain pragmatism in how and why companies like yours, the leaders in this area, are willing to pay up front for some of these technologies, that because there is great uncertainty about the alternatives, which might be, let's say, the nature-based credits that are struggling to find their verification and transparency and authentication and markets and so on, that you want to get in early and have the right to purchase engineered credits. That is to be, have the right for future purchases, and because you've made commitments on net zero that you intend to keep. And so in other words, there's a selfish reason, as it were, or a business reason to do it.
Yeah, and there's a business reason beyond that, right? And I think it's important to actually keep in mind who the decision makers are at these big companies that we're asking to buy carbon credits. They're people who don't understand these markets. They run businesses. That's their job. And these things ultimately to them are, if you're not careful, can be viewed as a purchase of a good that doesn't have a return to the company.
Right.
And so why are we spending that money is the ultimate question you have to answer.
It's actually a question that's coming on Slido. How do you persuade senior leadership of the need to do it?
And for us, there was a couple of different, look, if other financial institutions were doing this at scale at the time, it's always easy to point to that and say, competitively, we should do this. That wasn't the case at the time. And so it was to say, if we want to be a leader in what we believe is an emerging asset class, we should start looking at this now, get involved. We think we can build client relationships with these companies. We'd already raised capital for Climeworks. We have subsequently raised capital for Heirloom. We now bank some of those other companies we've purchased from. And so there is a virtuous cycle, if you will, of business opportunity associated with it. And that's been one of the ways that we've sort of pushed this internally.
Yeah. Any quick question? Do you see a quick hand here? Just we'll do this fast because I know people are getting ready for lunch, but let's get a question. Go.
Thank you very much. I'm Nikita with Offset Capital. We are long-term investors building a carbon portfolio out of Abu Dhabi. My question is, you have companies like JP Morgan, Microsoft, Google, who make commitments for carbon. They have high CSR and they want to scale the market. Now, do you think we can scale the voluntary carbon market sufficiently with purely a moral case? Or should we switch more to compliance cases like Corsia and force companies' hands and make it a business case to properly scale carbon markets?
The short answer is no, the moral case is not going to solve the problem. It just won't, unfortunately. I know we all want it to, but I think we need to be realists about it. Happy to talk more about it. I'm recognizing.
Yeah, let's talk over lunch over that. Let's get another quick question here.
Nandini Wilkie. I'm the co-founder of Carbon Pool. We are a carbon insurance company, which Vijay was kind enough
we had the pleasure to meet earlier.
Give me a shout out earlier, so I feel absolutely compelled to stand up and ask a question. But I actually did want to ask, Brian, when you guys think about nature-based solutions, how are you thinking about risk mitigation strategies? I know insurance hasn't been very visible in this space, and that's starting to change now. How confident are you in those contractual remedies that you are insisting on in the contracts? Because from what I've heard, they aren't. When you're dealing with a developer who's not necessarily a credit-worthy party, you don't really have someone standing behind that contract, and that's where we hope that insurance can help, but just want to know what you're thinking about.
Yeah, I think for now, and I would admit that JP Morgan's probably in a slightly different position than maybe some other buyers, but for now, we're building contracts that we feel like are supportive of our needs in the future. Most of our nature-based contracts are spot or at least short-term, so like 3 years. So we're not as concerned as sort of the long game. But I do agree with you that is one of the biggest contractual hangups or conversations is liability, who's responsible if leakage, if non-delivery, if late delivery. So I do think that insurance actually has a significant role to play, but I agree it still hasn't yet sort of found its place broadly, and we need to figure out how to get it into the ecosystem.
I'm sure she's going to work on that.
Yeah.
We are out of time, but you can tell this is a fun topic. I'm sure the gentleman will entertain your questions over lunch. Please enjoy, and we'll reconvene after the lunch.